Okay, great. Hi, everyone. I am Alex Skako. I am a senior researcher at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. It is such a pleasure to welcome all of you to our Displacement, Migration, and Integration seminar series. So for those who don't know, this event is organized by Evidence in Governance and Politics, otherwise known as EGAP. EGAP is a research, evaluation, and learning network made up of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, and we aim to promote knowledge accumulation and to support evidence-based policymaking. So recently, EGAP established a set of priority themes to help bring together researchers and practitioners to discuss issues at the forefront of particular fields, and to try to kind of help build a concrete research agenda in a particular field. And today's discussion is the second seminar event for the Displacement, Migration, and Integration priority theme. So you can read more about our priority theme on the EGAP website. And it's beautifully appearing in the chat right now. Okay, so today I'm so excited that we're going to be discussing reshaping locals' attitudes towards migrants during wartime in Afghanistan, a really fascinating field experiment conducted by today's panelists in Kandahar, Afghanistan, in collaboration with Mercy Corps. So before we jump into the discussion, I am really delighted to introduce our panelists. So first, we have Yang Zhou, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of British Columbia, and she's currently on leave as a Harvard Academy Scholar. So Yang has already done and is currently engaged in a range of just really groundbreaking research across the global South, across multiple continents, on the impacts of migration on host country economies and societies, and on different strategies aimed at improving migrant-host relations. Our second panelist is Jason Lyle, and he is the James Wright Chair in Transnational Studies, and he's an associate professor of government at Dartmouth College, where he also directs the Political Violence Field Lab. And over the course of his career, Jay has done truly foundational research on a broad and deep set of questions about the dynamics and consequences of wartime violence. And finally, we have Brett Barrowman, who's our practitioner joining us today. And he is a senior specialist for research and evaluation at the International Republican Institute, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that implements democracy and governance programs across the globe. Brett has been at IRI for the past 5 years, where he supports the development of applied social science research and evaluation methods across the Institute's thematic and regional portfolios. Okay, so we've got our introduction out of the way. So now we're going to do about 25 to 30 minutes of discussion with our panel. And so rather than a kind of traditional lecture and then Q&A format, we're really gonna structure this as a series of questions directed to our various panelists. And then afterwards, there'll be plenty of time for audience members to ask questions. All right, so let's kick it off. So the first question I'd like to direct to Yang. And so can you tell us a bit about the real world problem that this study is trying to address? Oh no, we can't hear you. Nope.
How about now?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay, I just unplugged my mic, so we're just gonna have to use the
You sound great.
computer mic. Okay, great. Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks so much for that kind introduction, Alex, and thanks to EGAP for this opportunity. The general problem of our study is in a context where one group of people is prejudiced against another group of people, can prolonged and meaningful social contact work to reduce that prejudice. And to be more specific, in our case, can a vocational training program, which is a very common type of program that humanitarian and development organizations implement all the time, can this kind of program that brings together locals and migrants in Kandahar, Afghanistan, reduce locals' negative attitudes towards migrants in this very active wartime setting? And so, of course, the theoretical backbone that we're testing is the contact hypothesis, which was articulated in the 1950s by Gordon Allport. And this hypothesis posits that contact under conditions of like equal status between groups, having cooperative goals between groups, and having institutional support, that kind of meaningful contact can help to reduce prejudice. And as we all know, there's been so many kinds of contact studies, but as recent meta-analyses by Betsy Pallack, Chelsea Clark, Rodney Peratt, and Don Green show, most of these studies are not experimental, or they're small in scale, they're confined to lab settings, and most of them are done in Western context. So our study tries to innovate in a few ways, and I'm just going to talk really briefly about two of them right now before we actually get into the intervention. The first is that we're doing a randomized control trial in a non-Western setting. Some recent studies that are like that our study hopes to build on is, of course, the one done in Nigeria by you and Shana. Hi, Shana. Salma Musa's study in Iraq. Cyrus Sami and Ruth Diedelman's work in Israel, and also separately Haggai Weiss's work in Israel. But these are exceptions to this broad kind of study. I don't think they're the typical kind of contact study. And so for ours, we're studying a very naturalistic intervention in wartime Afghanistan. This intervention is already one that exists in the world, and that's what we mean by naturalistic. We did not design the program. It's a flagship program that our partner Mercy Corps has been successfully implementing for many years in many different contexts. The second innovation is that we're looking at migrants as an outgroup category, and we think that's pretty rare as well. Most contact studies focus on different groups based on differences in race or religion. And, we know that attitudes are very difficult to move in terms of prejudice. But with a category like migrant status, we think because, it might not be as deep-seated or historic as racial tensions or religious tensions, that prejudice against this group might be movable with a kind of program like this. And so that's the general problem we're trying to tackle.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So this is a pretty intensive, certainly, like you said, relative to a lot of other studies in this field, there's a very intensive intervention, and it's very complex. Could you, because not everyone will have read your wonderful paper, maybe for you and Jay, could you walk us through a bit of the nuts and bolts of what exactly the intervention involved?
Sure, I'd be happy to take that. And thanks again, Alex, for moderating. And thank you to everyone for coming out for our paper. So we have to cast our minds back to 2015, 2016, when the intervention actually took place. And as Young mentioned, this is Mercy Corps' kind of flagship vocational training program, which was designed to target at-risk youth, with really meaning between 18 and 23, both men and women, and to provide them with vocational training in various intervals to give them a sort of better life chances. And indirectly, it allows us to test a lot of counterinsurgency theories about hearts and minds and whether this changes attitudes towards the government, or in this case, towards the Taliban. And so we had about 2,600 individuals, about just a little over 1/3 were women in our particular sample. They were randomly assigned into 3 or 6 month vocational training programs, quite extensive. So they would be 5 days a week for about 6 to 7 hours a day. And they were learning things like motorcycle engine repair, or solar panel repair, or English in some cases, or computer literacy skills. And the sample was divided almost in half between migrants and between local Kandaharis. And so we have a setting in which people are spending a substantial amount of time together in relative proportions of migrants and locals together. And so some of the classes had as low as 1/3 migrants, some had as high as 2/3 migrants. So it is this very naturalistic kind of intervention where they're spending just large amounts of time together. And so we measured attitudes at baseline. We measured attitudes about 2 weeks after the program concluded. And then we did a follow-up about 8 months later to see if attitudes were moving across these particular windows of time. And just in terms of cost, as you mentioned, it was really quite extensive. We had a lot of partners on the ground, which we can get into. We had an entire organization tree of all of the people involved. And it really actually quite an expensive intervention as well. So it's about $230 per person kind of going through this, just to kind of give us a sense of the scale involved. And so again, just really quickly, 2,600 individuals, roughly broken between migrants and locals, spending either 3 months together or 6 months together, really sustained kind of contact period. And then 2 measurement points of attitudes, one right when the program ended and one about 8 to 9 months after it had concluded.
Great. Thank you so much. So Jay, yeah, so for anyone who's not directly in this field, this is first of all a really large study. 2,600 is enormous. And most of these types of studies are a few hundred people at best. And then just the sheer intensity of it, like, a lot of contact, really great contact studies involve like a day or two, maybe of a training where people come together. And this is, many months. And the fact that it's full time, that this is five days a week, you said. So just underlining that, this is intensive. This is not light touch. If anything should work in terms of treatment intensity, this is it. Okay, so the next question, I guess also for Jay, could you tell us, I'm just really curious about the context where you conducted the intervention. So, most of us who do this kind of work and others who do this kind of work are, in settings where conflict kind of could happen again, or it's recently concluded, but this seems to be sort of a live conflict zone. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, how that affected any aspect of the research.
It was definitely a live conflict zone. And so we had 4 vocational training centers that Mercy Corps established in Kandahar city itself. At this time, so this is 2015, 2016, Kandahar city is sort of a relative bubble of security that's surrounded by largely Taliban-dominated regions. About half of our sample, who are mostly the migrants, are coming in from neighboring districts. And so they are moving in every day into the VTCs. And so there's the security issues of people kind of coming into the vocational training centers and then leaving every day. It was, there was a lot of violence. I mean, outside, particularly Kandahar city itself, the Taliban were actively recruiting at this time, particularly targeting the migrant population as people who might be joining the Taliban. So, I agree. A lot of experiments are sort of hypothetical violence or the sort of shadow of violence.
Yeah.
This was in real proportions. We had several attacks that shut down the experiment for a day or two for security reasons. We had, again, active recruitment within the migrant population. We had a local population that feared the migrants as security threats, as potentially bringing crime into the area, and as economic competitors as well. And so survey work in the area suggested that the local population was very worried about this population on numerous fronts. And so again, the difference we're looking at between populations isn't necessarily ascriptive, like most contact theories, but it is highly salient in this environment because of the sort of local context in which people are working within. And so this obviously, logistically made this far more complicated than anyone would want. I mean, I have to say just a quick shout out to all of the partners that worked with this just to give you a sense. I mean, Mercy Corps was lead and they designed it. We had 3 different Afghan government agencies involved working with this. We had UNHCR working with us. We had a small firm that worked for us to help us monitor everything that was going on. We had a local survey firm. And the experiment also had a unconditional cash transfer arm, which was sent through mobile phones. And so we were working with Roshan, which is the large national telecommunications company. And so we all kind of pooled together to make this happen. And so this would not have been possible logistically or otherwise without a lot of great people working together on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is really incredible. I should say again, for people who are kind of not in this particular inside baseball sort of field, it's kind of like a small or large miracle that this was even pulled off. So we take for granted the existence of projects like this, and we all want to dive in and start nitpicking on like small stuff, but just that this exists is like kind of a triumph. So, and the fact that it exists, I'd love to hear a little more. How did this project come about? There's so many things going on. What was the initial motivation for the project? And how did you even get involved in this in the first place? Maybe Jay, you can speak to this again.
Sure. So like many things I work on, usually by accident is how this kind of came out. So Mercy Corps had run this INVEST program in the neighboring province of Helmand earlier. And they had put about 20,000 people through it. So it was very large scale.
Wow.
And at an EGAP meeting, I believe it was Rebecca Wolf and I and Kosuke Amai were sitting together, and she said, wouldn't it be great if we knew what happened with that program? And our ears perked up and said, yes, it would be great. Would you turn over the data? And we did. Now, unfortunately, it was observational. They didn't have an RCT design and we didn't have any control. So we really couldn't say anything about what the program was doing for, violence in these areas or things like that. But they were rolling it out in Kandahar. And so through a lot of persuasion and conversations, they agreed to give us one tranche of these 4 vocational waves that were going out, and allowed us to work with the RCT. So really, this came out because of happenstance, but also came about because of EGAP, because it was an EGAP meeting where we were meeting on the sidelines and chatting that sort of led to this now many-year collaboration.
That is a perfect answer. I'm so happy to hear that.
Not planned at all either. That
not
was
planned at all. Like, that's great. So, okay. So I wonder, Brett, maybe you could jump in here if you have any thoughts. Like, it seems like this was something that was going on already. It had sort of an initial plan, and then there was this evolution. Didn't start out as a contact, very specific contact intervention, and it became in part a contact study. I'm curious if practitioners are typically open to evolutions like this.
Let me just give a little background on my role here for folks that might be wondering what's IRI doing talking about a Mercy Corps program. So I was sort of invited as a practitioner discussant just to give some practitioner perspective on both the implementation side and sort of interpretation and utilization of results. So just to be clear for the folks in the audience, I was not involved in the project. I certainly do not speak for Mercy Corps, and I've been in the business 5 years or so, so certainly don't speak for all practitioners on the project or on the subject. So would be interested in other perspectives, maybe in the Q&A. I mean, I think a couple of things. One, is I'm totally in awe of Mercy Corps on this. I think they really have to be commended for kind of being willing to evaluate a program on outcomes that it was not necessarily designed for, right? There are really strong disincentives to do that in a lot of ways. And doing this kind of study imposes real constraints on a program for reasons I'll talk about in a second. But really, want to sort of give a shout out to Mercy Corps for being, I think, a model for implementing organizations for this.
Right.
On the question, yes and no. I mean, I think there are a few things, especially for the academic folks in the audience, about practitioners' incentives to adapt in this way. I mean, I think in an ideal world, we would have an objective, right? We would have a thing that we're trying to change, and we would have a relatively blank slate, and we'd propose a few different alternative approaches that might get at that, and maybe evaluate one against another or whatever it is, right? In reality, that's not necessarily how it works. Like, an implementing organization is not coming at something with a blank slate. They usually have a repertoire of approaches that they're pretty comfortable implementing. And then, as a social scientist working in this space, it's part of my job to sort of shoehorn or back into that into, theory or a results chain that makes sense, right? So in that sense, I mean, I think that folks can sort of be amenable on the theory end. That's balanced by this sort of disincentive to evaluate, right? There's not necessarily much upside to evaluating on outcomes that you didn't plan for. largely because of the structure of the way that projects are designed, right? So we're often encouraged to see things in terms of, very specific problems. Often when we're responding to a request for proposals, a funder, at least in my experience, I work primarily with United States government funders, will give us a specific problem set, right? A set of objectives that they would like a program to work on. Everything else in the proposal is shaped around those objectives, right? So the background, a theory section, a description of activities, a results chain that leads from program inputs to outputs to outcomes to impact. All of those things are geared toward very specific goals. So it's a program team is not necessarily going to be thinking about, is the program I'm comfortable implementing going to work on, intergroup relations if the program is what we're really working on is vocational training, right?
It's really
So
interesting.
There's a sort of balance there, yeah.
And it's sort of maybe a little different than how academics think about this. Like, to me, I'm like, why not test it on this extra thing? It's just a great bonus. Like, maybe you shifted something you never even would have thought about shifting.
Right.
But I think that's a good segue into, it kind of then depends on the results of the study. And so maybe Yang, could you walk us through some of the core results of the study?
Yeah, sure. So, from the title of our study, I think you can guess this is a null results paper.
Yeah.
To give some context, at baseline, we asked for self-reported behavior, which was just how much, contact do you have with migrants in your community generally. And at baseline for both locals that were going to be in the treatment and the control group across the board, about half said that they never had any interactions with migrants in the broader community. And then those who did, it was very infrequent. We also asked a couple attitudinal questions, things like, what are your general perceptions of migrants? Do you think that they are more supportive of violence than locals? Do they take jobs away from locals? And a couple attitudinal questions like that. At baseline, these responses were normally distributed, but they weren't super tight around neutral. And so that told us that there's a substantial group that felt positively towards migrants, but a substantial group that felt negatively. And we think because it wasn't skewed that way, we were pretty hopeful that we were going to be able to shift those attitudes. So at endline, 2 weeks after the program, null results across the board, no difference between treated locals who were treated in this program and the control group. There's no difference between class composition. So locals who were in classes with more migrants versus less migrants, no difference between locals who were in 3-month versus 6-month classes. And we also didn't see differences based on the locals' own demographic characteristics, like men versus women, Pashtun, non-Pashtun, younger versus older. The other innovation of our study, as Jay mentioned, is that we measured outcomes again 7 months later to see if there were any long-term changes. And the same thing, just null results across the board. And so while this was, kind of disheartening to see that, contact did not have the effects that we thought it might have, on the other hand, there was sort of a glass, half full, half empty kind of quality, in that we were concerned that because this program is an economic program, it's a vocational skills training program in an environment that was already economically scarce, it might have actually led to more feelings of economic competition and enmity. And we didn't see that either. So at least we think, the program didn't increase feelings of economic resentment.
Right. So, just to put this in okay, thank you so much. Just to put this in context, there are a number of recent studies, including my own with Shayna Warren, that really try very hard to have a non-light touch, very intensive intervention, and just don't find attitude shifting. So this is not like some strange thing that happened, and this is also true for Salma Musa's work in Iraq. This is very hard, and particularly in these kind of conflict settings. So one quick funny thing, like when Shayna and I were working on trying to explain this null result, and I know you guys have been working on this too, we'd often have chats with psychologists who would say, oh, well, it takes time for these things to develop. Like maybe you just measure things too quickly. And if you just came back in a year or two, then, contact really would work. And I think it's great that you can say, no, but we came back 7 months later, and it's not like some kind of, delayed effect. Like this didn't work right away and it didn't work in the long run, at least in terms of shifting attitudes. Okay, fabulous. So how have these results been used so far? Have they been used by the implementing partner, or have they been used by you guys to design new studies that are kind of spin-offs of this? Maybe Jay, you could speak to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in. So to be honest, I'm not exactly sure how the results have been used. And I say that in part because the initial intervention where we're looking at the economic effects on political attitudes, the Mercy Corps was very interested in that because that was a direct spin-off of the program. And so there were briefings in New America Foundation, the Pentagon, a variety of different sort of outreach activities and things like that. The contact theory or hypotheses we're testing, it just was less, I think, in Mercy Corps' interest and less in their wheelhouse. And so, I think they were interested, but not terribly interested, just because it's not what they were programmed against, as Brett kind of mentioned. And so I'm not sure if this has actually made it back inside. I mean, for us as the academics, I mean, this has generated a ton of different ideas about what we could do for future work and sort of future directions. And I think that we can talk maybe a little bit later, but there's like 5 different papers come out of these null findings. But I think, maybe Brett can speak to this. I think it's harder for implementing partners to take null results and know what to do with them in terms of policy. And in particular, there, as Young mentioned, there isn't a lot of literature on contact in conflict settings yet, which is where a lot of programming is going. So I think there's a big question of like, how much do you weight one study that's a null finding, and when there isn't that much cumulative evidence yet? And so I think it kind of went into Mercy Corps' think tank database, right? And sort of said, okay, well, that's a data point, but we're not sure necessarily what to do with it. Maybe once we see more studies, we'll have a direction, and then we can build on that. So for now, it's a data point, but it's not necessarily something we would shape all of our programming around because it is just one study. That's my read of their sense.
Right. Well, thanks. Brett, what do you do with the null results?
It's a really tough question. I mean, I don't think my response would differ substantively from Jay. I mean, I think, I guess let me talk for a second about what I like about the paper and the presentation of results, which I think, like, we pass around a lot of academic papers that are relevant to programs, and this is an example of one that's sort of very clear, like mostly free of jargon, doesn't parse sentences. It's just a very clear presentation of everything from sort of theory to interpretation of results and elimination of alternative explanations. So I want to just mention a few things about that as we're thinking about how to translate, something that's written for a scientific audience just to some kind of product that's accessible for people implementing programs. Again, like there's clear language throughout. The title's a great example of this. Like, what you're getting into by the time you read the abstract. It's great. I like that it's really, really clear about what the range of possible outcomes could be. That's not always clear, right? It's, it could, a program could make things better. That's often, I think, how practitioners are thinking, right? We're an optimistic bunch, even if we're sort of, constructively skeptical of the work sometimes. It could have no effect, right? It could actually make things worse. It could keep things from getting worse at a lower rate or something like that, right? So I think the clear explanation of the potential range of outcomes that you could see from a program is really good. Throughout, there's a sort of really good emphasis on contextualizing the results and explaining why we might be seeing these results, right? That, the idea that especially in, wartime situations, these sort of attitudes might be particularly sticky because of the risks of misplacing trust or something like that. I mean, I think that's really, really important context for folks that are thinking about policy or designing programs. I actually really like the discussion of program parameters and explicit hypotheses. That's really easy to pull out, right? So variables in a program like dosage, scale, content, those just make it, I think, really clear to folks the sort of things they can manipulate in a program to help them adapt, right?
Yeah. Great. I hope that, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I mean, I just like one more thing. I just like, I really liked in the context of the null results issue, contextualizing the discussion of results and posing and refuting some alternative explanations is
Mhm.
really, really important, right? Because I think we do need people to help us think through why we might be seeing a null result, what some possible explanations are, and what the favorite explanation is by the team, right? So that's one thing. I mean, I think to Jay's point, yeah, we probably shouldn't be making policy or program decisions based on single studies, right? One big challenge I see in distributing single studies is the problem of potentially sort of chasing the latest results.
Right.
Right. And so there's not a big body of literature on this. So I would really like to see practitioners use this kind of framework where we're evaluating how much any single study kind of moves the needle on our previous expectations about what the result
Right.
is going to look like. That's particularly challenging in fields where we don't have a strong body of evidence, as is the case here. But I think that's an argument for sort of more studies, more replications, and a challenge for us in thinking through how do we evaluate how much any one single study moves our expectations on the problem.
Right. Thanks so much, Brett. That's great. I mean, I will say that contact is one of those few political science areas. We sort of picked this up on the back of the psychologists, where there have been a lot of studies, and we're finally getting to the point where I feel like we can do some really nice normal science the way psychologists get to do that we never do, where there are, especially in the last, say, 5 years, a whole bunch of field experiments in this area. And now we can start, like Betsy Pollock and others, I think Yang mentioned this, have done some really great meta-analyses. So we are in a position where we maybe can start like really accumulating knowledge. So, watch this space in a couple of years. Okay, and that leads into sort of our final question before we turn over to the Q&A. So this is something that I know the researchers have been mulling over, something I certainly mull over all the time. And it's really just, what is the frontier? Like, what's next for intergroup contact research? I mean, should there be a future for this type of intervention? Are we over it? And if we aren't doing contact interventions, what should take their place? And I think this is something we all have thoughts on. So maybe, I don't know, Yang or Jay, if you want to start us off on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've landed on 2 points here. The first is specifically with our study, our program didn't have an explicit curriculum around prejudice reduction. So there was nothing within the program itself that, through perspective taking or any kind of curriculum that aimed at locals to reduce their prejudice towards migrants. Maybe that's something we're missing. Maybe our program was just too subtle. It was only focused on vocational training, and adding those components. A lot of other people have been doing studies on strategies like perspective taking, getting you to try and empathize with an outgroup can change your attitudes, at least in the short term. Maybe adding some of those components would help. But the other point I have is, going to your question, even though I've just started on this research, I'm already a little bit over it. And I think that's because, I'm a student of Betsy Pollock. When I jumped on this program, I was first the graduate research assistant for that first observational study in Helmand. And then I got to join on as a co-author on this study. And because I was in Betsy's lab, I was like, let's add a couple questions to see if this sort of naturalistic contact would do anything. And even though I do think this program met those original outport conditions, doing a program in this wartime setting, that's like a structural issue that even a 6-month program is going to have a lot of difficulty overcoming. And so where I land is, contact, if it's done as in an institutional structural way, I do think works. But increasingly, these types of programs, whether it's playing sports together or computer classes or vocational training or diversity trainings, if it's not like a big institutional or structural change, I'm becoming really skeptical of it. And I think it also focusing resources and time and academic, just us studying these types of smaller programs and turning things on and off, stuff like that. I think that gives a pass to governments or policymakers or organizations from doing the really hard work and changing structures. Some of the policymakers that I talk to are all in the refugee space. And right now, one thing that they are really excited about contact to get, refugees and host communities to have more solidarity. And yet, instead they're not focusing on advocating for things like closing camps and letting refugees settle in more urban areas. And that is a structural change. That's just desegregation. So that's where I sort of land.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, so one answer is, okay, all-Portian contact is so specific. It has to be, there's a couple of neat questions in the chat about Allport too, like, all roads always somehow lead us back to Allport, and maybe they shouldn't, right? Like, we need to move on from that very specific type of contact. And I also love your point about existing institutional structures or large institutional structures. And I feel like the contact field experiments that have been most successful and have had the most positive and large results have been things like college roommate studies, where there's a university there, people have to live together in the dorms anyway, and then they live together for 2 years, and lo and behold, this type of really intense, kind of large scale, realistic contact is maybe, if we're going to do contact stuff at all, this is where we should be kind of putting our energy. Okay, I don't know if anyone else has anything to say on this, but we're kind of keeping time really well. We have about 20 minutes left, and we have a lot of fantastic questions in the chat. So I think the best thing to do next is I'm just going to take a quick look and then sort of direct these. Okay, one quick sec. Going back. Okay, so one simple but really important question to start us off. We have a question from Sandy that's just, what did the study define as migrants? And I feel like this is not as easy a question as it sounds. So what did you guys mean by migrants?
By migrants, we meant
yeah.
internally displaced persons. So these were migrants from other parts of Afghanistan because of the war have moved to urban centers in Kandahar. They're separated from the local population because they tend to live in like IDP camps. And so that was the major way that within our program, locals knew that they were migrants. They're coming from the IDP camps. But yes, not foreign migrants.
Okay, great. Thank you. I hope that clears that up. Okay, so we have some questions from Dan Posner. So one question Dan has is that you guys, I think Jay mentioned there was also a cash transfer as maybe an alternative treatment arm or some other aspect of the study. Did you measure outcomes among those who received the cash versus those who didn't? And the idea here is, does alleviating economic vulnerability have an impact on attitudes toward migrants?
We did look at that, and in our very long SI section, also no results.
Oh.
Yeah, but it was a very large cash transfer.
Right, very large cash transfer too. Okay, I mean,
can I just ask,
Jay,
just
please.
for context, the cash transfer was equivalent of 4 months' wages.
Whoa.
So I mean, when we talk cash transfer, it's a big shock, not a little one, and it's a one-time unconditional cash transfer to their phone. So it is a big sort of effort to move it, and nothing.
But just to add to that, it doesn't mean that we're finding nulls for everything that we've ever measured, which I think would tell us something different. In a previous study that we published in APSR, the cash transfer does move attitudes, just not attitudes on prejudice against migrants.
What attitudes does it move again? Can you remind me? Maybe Yang Yang. You guys are so modest. Like you're just trying to. I'll just say, Yang Yang, tell us.
Yeah, so it does improve attitudes towards supporting the government versus the Taliban. There's some mixed findings there, but yeah, it does help with that.
Okay.
And we think it's because, even though the program was implemented by Mercy Corps, there's a lot of credit claiming by government officials around that program.
Okay, great. All right, let me go back to the chat. So there's a question here that really links up with something you were starting to talk about, Yang Yang. Chris Grady is saying, do you think contact style programs that seek to reduce prejudice and improve intergroup relations need an explicit emphasis, like a kind of curriculum emphasis on intergroup harmony? Should we be less subtle? Yeah. Maybe
It's
Yang
po-
Yang, I'll give that to you too, yeah.
It's possible. It's not in Alport's original conditions, but we can
Oh,
move
no.
away from Alport. Oh no, it is possible, and I think there are definitely some really promising studies on perspective taking. I'm thinking work by Brockman and Kalla,
Right.
Adida, Platas, and Lowe, and others. So that is possible, but
Right.
again, then we get into this other question of, well, then do you need this condition versus that condition?
Right,
How
right,
much
right.
of that condition? And if we need like a very specific setup for each time, then it really calls into question the whole framework, right?
Yeah, I think that's really fair. And also, I mean, so this is something that I'm trying to work on with Salma Musa in Lebanon, where we have a kind of a contact intervention like this, again, maybe we should all be moving on, but in one treatment arm, you get an explicit peace messaging overlay on top of Lebanese Syrian migrant contact. And in one condition, they're just talking about health and nutrition. So, the idea is, can we see if this actually makes things better? But it's also possible that it could make things worse. Like there's a lot of research in the US context where people don't like diversity trainings, and they don't like it when you try to kind of cram this stuff down their throats. So I do think, Chris is saying, yeah. So Chris, I do actually think this is a good question. We're not making fun of your question. This is a good one. And the answer is we don't know, and it could go either way. Okay, let's see. I saw some good questions from Gareth. I just have to find them. Oh yeah, Gareth asked a design question. Was there randomized variation in the ratio of migrants to non-migrants in the training groups? Jay, do you want to say? Yeah.
Oh, well, I was just going to say no. That was
Oh.
part of the sort of the natural process of people sifting into the classes. So we did not have randomized control over the composition. But just again, the balance in there was anywhere from about, I think 36% was the lowest to about 55%, or no, maybe actually 67% migrant. So we have variation in that, but no, we did not control the randomization of the composition of the
Okay.
locals and
Okay.
migrants. Yeah.
Good. So Nazita has a couple of questions. I'm just going to pull out one that I think is extra interesting. So do you have any evidence? Were you guys able to look at whether the intervention led to sustained contact beyond the purview of the vocational training program? Like, did people become friends? Did they report that they were friends with their classmates? Or I think that's a helpful question, like to get a sense of, did people bond in this program? Because for Alport, you need friendship potential, right?
I think we can answer this question just qualitatively. We did some focus groups afterwards of the participants, and we also interviewed all of the trainers, the teachers of the vocational training programs. Based on what the trainers told us, they said first that there was not, as far as they noticed, self-segregation within the classrooms. So it's not like during the classes, migrants were at one table, locals were at another table. In fact, they were always very actively learning together, so working on projects together. And so we hope from that, they made friends. I don't think in the focus groups we specifically asked about if they formed friendships, but we did get like a lot of positive feedback about the programs. They really enjoyed it. They had wished it was longer. And that shows because we had really high compliance. I think we had over 70% compliance of people doing the classes. On the survey, we only just asked for a self-reported behavioral measure, which is, how much contact do you have with migrants outside of the vocational training in your own communities. And yeah, we just didn't see any changes in that.
Alex, I would just add really quickly, I think there might be structural obstacles to sort of friendship outside classrooms, given the wartime setting. So there is restrictions on mobility and gathering and things like that. And also almost all of the migrants in the sample were coming from sort of outside Kandahar city locations. And so there's like a physical separation where they go back to it at night based on where they live and things like that. That would probably put a dent in your ability to have friendships outside classrooms. Not saying it's impossible, and of course you can text and things like that, But I think
Right.
sort of there is a constraint on how much extra kind of curricular friendship you
Oh,
can form
that's
in
really
this setting.
interesting. And that seems like a potentially really rich kind of possible explanation for a null finding, right? Because it's not just contact itself, but it's really like supposedly becoming friends, getting more information about the out group. And it seems like outside of class, just hanging out after class might make that easier to kind of actually break down stereotypes and stuff. So, and this speaks to this other huge issue of just doing this at all in a war zone. Maybe it just cuts off some of these potential mechanisms. Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. Okay. So Dan Posner had another question. He says the contact occurred in the context of a job training program. Was there any sense of competition among the participants, for example, for prospective jobs? Could this have worked against the beneficial effect of contact? Yang, maybe? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that was something we were concerned about. We asked about it specifically at baseline. There was definitely, a substantial number of participants who felt that migrants take away jobs. And so that was a concern that we had. Like, it wasn't obvious to us that this kind of contact would actually lead to more positive versus actually more have a backlash effect and have more negative attitudes. But we didn't see on that question changes at our end line or second end line either. So, on the one hand, it could be that those two forces balance themselves out precisely. But
Right.
that the positive effects from contact gets washed out from, the competition effects. But
Okay.
at least we didn't see that happen.
Right. So it could have gotten worse. Yeah, Jay.
I would just add too that I think Mercy Corps and the instructors in the program are particularly alive to this possibility. And so a lot of what they did in the classroom exercises were these sort of collaborative projects. So they would try and have like a joint task. I'm not to go back to Allport again, but like there's a joint task, right? That they're all
Collaboration.
Collaboration and in a sort of a friendly space. And so, we have pictures of the motorcycle repair and the entire class is around the engine and trying to fix that one engine to get it working together again. So it's not to say that those tensions weren't there, but they were definitely trying to sort of pull the teeth out. Yeah.
So it's like vocational training, but warm and fuzzy.
Collaborative, right? Like this sort of collaborative, we're all in this together. We're all going to get a certificate at the end.
Yes.
Kind of thing, rather than, we're going to promote one group over the other kind of thing or something.
Right. So at least within the setting of the intervention itself, it sounds like it wasn't competitive. I'm thinking, for example, here of like Matt Lowe's really interesting study. I think it's with cricket, maybe in India, bringing together different sectarian groups. And we all love playing together on the team, but wait till we now start competing. And, as soon as you turn something collaborative into something competitive, it really undoes all of the good work of the collaboration. Okay, great. Let's see. Okay, I have a question from Joseph Manager. What are some of the challenges associated with both short and long-term planning for displaced persons before they become integrated into a host community? Oh, that's a good question. I don't know which of you feels best prepared to answer that. That's a good one and a hard one.
I think Young's way deeper in this issue than I am, so I would cede the floor. Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think that's a really open question that a lot of us are wanting to study. Short and long-term planning. I guess for me, it depends on who's the actor you're thinking about. Host governments, for example, could do a lot. They could choose, just depending how they want to host migrants. Are they segregated from the larger community? Are they forced to be in camps or are they allowed to self-settle? Are they allowed to use local public services? Like, are their children getting to go to schools with locals and growing up together in schools together, or, use health facilities and shop at the same stores, things like that. So I feel like, as a structural condition, as we were saying before, segregation is a really big one. In our case, if migrants are going home to their IDP camps far away from local communities, and they don't have a natural way to, just hang out. I think that's a big structural issue, and one that we see a lot in different migrant and refugee hosting countries around the world. Great.
Thank you. Okay, another question from Chris Grady, who keeps putting in the questions. Thank you, Chris. This is a good one. How clear is it to people that an individual is a migrant and not a Kandaharian? Can Kandaharians easily tell that someone is a migrant? What signals migrant status? Jay, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so it's a great question, because again, we're dealing with something that's not necessarily ascriptive, right? In the way that context theory is usually tested. So there are a couple ways on which they could tell. Well, the biggest one is actually how you arrive at the VTC, right? So if you're a migrant, you're coming in collectively on a bus or a shuttle to the VTCs. The local Kandaharis are either in a private vehicle or walking kind of thing. So the way that they arrive is different. Depending on where the migrants are actually coming from. So we had a large influx of people from Uruzgan, Helmand, and other regions from the violence. Their actual local dress would be different than Kandaharis. That's less of a sort of precise marker, but they'd still be identifiable through clothing and things like that. So I'd say that the two biggest are the travel options in, and then the clothing. The other thing is, to me, I mean, I understand the question, but for me, like, if you're with somebody for 6 months, it would be very hard in this environment, I think, not to know that somebody is, it's sort of natural where you're coming from and to talk about those kind of things. And so I think even if there weren't these markers, they would have found out very quickly who was sort of very local and who was not.
Right. Thanks, Jay. Okay, another question from Sandy again. He says, the culture in Kandahar is quite unique compared to other parts of Afghanistan. I wonder if the same study conducted back in 2015, 2016 would reveal different results in a different part of the country in the current context. Maybe Jay, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, and so for sure, I mean, so Kandahar is different, although every place in Afghanistan seems to be different from every other place in Afghanistan. It's a very complicated country. And so I think that's right. And I think, it'd be fascinating to run this if the migrants and the locals were not the same sort of ethnic group, right? In a predominantly Pashtun environment. So if we had run this experiment in the north, for example, say in Kunduz, and we had an ethnic cleavage that we could exploit in the sense of locals being different ethnicity than the migrants, that may have generated a very different result. Maybe that the combination of migrant status and different ethnicity might have driven this, or in other areas, perhaps tribal differences within the Pashtuns might have driven this as well. So Afghanistan's a really tough place to generalize about anything, and so I'd be very reluctant to do that. And it is true, like if you're across the ethnic cleavage or across the tribal one in a greater depth than we were here, you may get sharper results.
Right. Can I just say something to Chris's last question? I think more generally, this question of how do we know someone is a migrant or not? I've been doing studies in a lot of different places, mostly in East Africa, and I'm always fascinated by this question because there's typically a lot of co-ethnicity between refugees just going across the border. And so I think usually it's very hard to tell. I'm just starting a study in Kenya, for example, in the Turkana region. Local Kenyans can easily tell from appearance and a lot of other descriptive things. In Garissa County, where you have Kenyan Somalis and Somali refugees, they'll tell you it's really hard to tell just based on looking someone, but the minute they speak, so through language, you can tell if someone is coming from Somalia or if someone is Kenyan, and the same in Tanzania. And so I think what that tells me is that even if migrant status isn't ascriptive, it's, just like any other ethnicity, race that is socially constructed, it's easy to form these boundaries and it's easy to make them way starker than they were, especially if you're a local and you don't want to be confused to be a migrant. If that's the case, then you're going to find ways to really differentiate yourself, and that those two outgroups will be starker and starker over time.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I really like that point. I mean, So I'm interested in this kind of question, for example, like in Lebanon, where I've just really, I mean, I'm not knowledgeable about Lebanon, but just working with other smart people who are, and that, you know, in contexts where you have kind of migrants that have been there for a long time, like say Palestinians, and then more recently arrived migrants like Syrians. And so the thought is, well, Syrians are new neighbors, Palestinians are old neighbors, so this should just be like a weak cleavage, and they haven't been there that long. There's not been enough time to really like disagree, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Like there is a lot of prejudice against Syrians and they haven't been there for very long. So it's kind of sad, but I think these can become salient pretty quickly. Oh, there's one last one from Dan and we have 1 minute. Let's see if we can squeeze it in. It occurs to me that regarding the intervention generates competition alongside contact issue. Do you have data on whether program graduates were able to get jobs? If all of them did, then the shadow of competition after graduation would loom less than if only a handful were able to get jobs after finishing the program. Are you guys able to kind of track this or economic outcomes?
I think that was in our first paper, and Jay, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we found that almost nobody was able to get jobs.
Oh,
Very
okay.
Exactly. It was the few people that could find work were typically as apprentices rather than the actual trade that they wanted to be in. And so it had almost no success at landing people permanent jobs.
Oh, this is tough.
Yeah.
So I remember when I first presented like this similar kind of vocational training thing in Nigeria, and it's similar, it's not a great economy. I mean, I'm sure it's not as bad as this, but, you know, someone asked, well, now that you've done this contact thing, why didn't you just like, you know, create jobs for them? Like, why didn't you find ways to help them get jobs and see if you could encourage, you know, intergroup cooperation? And so at some point, you know, you've already done so much. You can only, you know, you can't actually create jobs as far as I know. So this is hard. Okay. So there have been wonderful questions. I just wanted to thank so much to the audience for coming. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, all three of you. And yeah, goodbye, everyone. Oh, and Jacqueline is saying something important. Yes, there will be an email with the link we shared today and a link to the recording of this seminar. Okay, thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, guys.